The flagship reel cuts through the Gulf of Patras at dawn, October 7th, 1571. Don John of Austria stands on the prow, 24 years old, watching the horizon darken with enemy sails. Behind him, 212 Christian galleys. Ahead, 275 Ottoman warships stretched 4 miles across the water. The Spanish soldiers around him finger their rosaries. Below deck, men chained to oars, some Christian, some Muslim, all trapped, pull in rhythm to drums they cannot see. Don John carries a burden no amount of armor can protect. He is the bastard son of an emperor, commanding an alliance that doesn't trust itself. Venice wants its Cypriot colonies back. Spain wants crusading glory. Genoa wants to avoid a catastrophe. The Pope wants proof that God still favors Rome. Each admiral in his fleet answers to a different crown, speaks a different language, harbors different fears about what happens if they lose this fight. The Ottomans under Ali Pasha have won nearly every significant engagement for a generation. Their janissaries are the finest infantry in the world. Their galleys are faster, their crews more experienced. They've just taken Cyprus, executing the Venetian garrison after promising them safe passage. The severed heads were sent back to Venice in barrels. The skin of the Venetian commander was stuffed with straw and paraded through Constantinople. That brutality has a purpose. It reminds every Christian sailor that surrender means nothing. Don John raises his hand. The trumpets sound across the water. Every galley raises its battle standard. The reel unfurls a massive blue banner bearing the image of Christ crucified, sewn by Spanish nuns specifically for this moment. It is both prayer and threat. God is watching. The distance between the fleets closes. 500 yards. 400. 300. The water between them disappears. By sunset, one of these navies will cease to exist. But which? For a century before Lepanto, the Mediterranean had been bleeding Christian power into Ottoman hands. Constantinople fell in 1453, severing Europe's land routes to Asia and forcing merchants to negotiate with an empire that viewed them as temporary guests, useful only as long as tribute continued to flow. Venice, the great maritime republic, had built its wealth on trade with the East. Now every convoy required Ottoman permission. Every negotiation ended with concessions. The fall of Rhodes in 1522 gave the Ottomans a naval base within striking distance of Italy itself. For 50 years after, Christian shipping moved under constant threat. Barbary corsairs, Muslim privateers operating with Ottoman blessing, raided as far north as Iceland, capturing tens of thousands of Europeans for the slave markets of Algiers and Constantinople. Coastal villages in Spain and Italy were simply abandoned. It was safer to live inland, to surrender the sea entirely. Pope Pius V understood that economics alone couldn't rally Europe. He needed something visceral. When the Ottomans laid siege to Cyprus in 1570, they provided it. The blockade of Famagusta lasted 11 months. The Venetian garrison, under Marcantonio Bragadin, held against impossible odds. When they finally surrendered in August 1571, the Ottoman commander Lala Mustafa Pasha gave his word: safe passage for all defenders. Instead, he had Bragadin's nose and ears cut off, then flayed him alive in the town square. The skin was displayed in Constantinople as a trophy. The brutality was calculated. It was meant to inspire terror, to convince Christian powers that resistance was futile. Instead, it gave Pius V the atrocity he needed. The Pope declared a holy league, binding Spain, Venice, Genoa, and the Papal States into a coalition with one mission: destroy the Ottoman fleet before it could strike Italy itself. Philip II of Spain pledged his half-brother Don John to command the expedition. Venice, desperate to reclaim Cyprus, committed nearly its entire navy. Genoa sent ships but hedged its commitment, wary of total annihilation. The alliance was fragile from conception. Venetian admirals resented Spanish arrogance. Spanish officers distrusted the Venetians' willingness to negotiate with Muslims when profit was at stake. Genoa wanted victory, but not at the cost of losing its merchant fleet. Don John, young and inexperienced, had to hold these factions together through sheer force of personality. His legitimacy was borrowed, his father's bloodline, his half-brother's authority. Lepanto was his chance to earn legitimacy through victory. Failure would prove he was merely an accident of royal birth. Below every deck on both fleets, men lived in chains. The galley, for all its romantic history, was fundamentally a machine powered by human suffering. Each vessel carried between 150 and 250 oarsmen, seated 5 to an oar, backs bent, hands blistered raw. They rowed in shifts measured by drumbeat, watched by overseers with whips. Ventilation was minimal. The disease was constant. On long voyages, mortality could reach 20% before a single shot was fired. The Ottoman fleet relied heavily on Christian captives. Thousands of men taken in raids on Greek islands, Italian coasts, and Spanish villages found themselves chained to Turkish oars. They were valuable because trained rowers took months to break in, but expendable. When a galley sank, the oarsmen drowned, chained to their benches. No one unlocked them during battle. There wasn't time, and there was no trust. The Christian galleys faced the exact moral arithmetic. Venice used convicted criminals, forzati, sentenced to the oar for theft, debt, or heresy. Spain used Muslim captives when available, but also relied on paid freemen supplemented by prisoners. The papal galleys carried men condemned by church courts. Every fleet claimed moral superiority while depending on forced labor to move. This created a tactical vulnerability that the Ottomans were unable to resolve. Their galleys carried thousands of enslaved Christians who had no reason to fight for their captors and every reason to revolt. Ottoman officers lived under constant tension, knowing that the men powering their advance could turn against them the moment discipline broke. Mutinies were rare because the reprisals were too brutal, but the possibility haunted every engagement. An officer commanding a war galley wasn't just managing an external enemy. He was managing the men below deck who could seize the first occasion they could to kill him. The Holy League understood this weakness. Before the battle, Don John's advisors calculated that if the fighting became close enough, if the lines dissolved into boarding actions, the Ottoman slaves might revolt. It was a gamble. There was no way to communicate with men chained in enemy hulls. However, if the mutiny were to occur, it would undermine Ottoman cohesion from within, thereby multiplying the League's numerical disadvantage into an overwhelming force. Don John of Austria had never commanded a fleet in battle. At 24, his military experience consisted of suppressing a Morisco rebellion in Spain. Brutal counterinsurgency, not naval warfare. His appointment as Generalissimo of the Holy League was political. He was of royal blood, acceptable to all factions, and young enough not to threaten the older admirals. But that same youth made him desperate. He needed this victory to prove he was more than his father's bastard, more than a figurehead holding together an alliance by accident of birth. His opponent, Muezzinzadeh Ali Pasha, was 57, a veteran of decades of Mediterranean warfare. He commanded from the flagship Sultana, a massive galley mounting 36 guns. His battle plan was orthodox: deploy in a crescent formation, use superior numbers to envelop the Christian flanks, and rely on janissary firepower to break the enemy center. It was the same strategy that had worked for generations. Ali Pasha saw no reason to deviate. But Ali Pasha's confidence created its own vulnerability. He believed the Holy League would fracture under pressure, that the Venetians and Spanish would blame each other when casualties mounted, that Don John would hesitate at the critical moment. He deployed his fleet in open water, giving the Christians room to maneuver, confident that Ottoman discipline and numbers would prevail in a straight fight. The tension inside the Holy League command was real. Days before the battle, the admirals met in council aboard the Real. Gianandrea Doria, commanding the Genoese squadron, argued for caution. The Ottoman fleet was larger, and their crews were more experienced. A defeat would leave Italy defenseless. Better to shadow them, harass their supply lines, wait for winter storms to disperse them. The Venetian commanders, led by Sebastiano Venier, demanded immediate attack. Every day the League delayed was another day Cyprus remained under Ottoman occupation. Venetian pride demanded action, and Venetian gold was funding half the expedition. They would not accept a delay. Don John sided with the Venetians, not because the strategic case was stronger, but because hesitation would shatter the alliance. If he ordered retreat, Venice would withdraw its ships, Spain would lose face, the Pope would declare the crusade a failure. The only path that preserved the coalition was forward, into a battle Don John wasn't sure he could win. The technological edge that would decide the Battle of Lepanto was invisible to most observers. 6 Venetian galleasses positioned at the front of the Christian line. They appeared to be standard galleys at a distance, but they were fundamentally different machines. Galleasses were massive hybrid vessels, too heavy and slow for ramming attacks, but mounting cannons that dwarfed anything the Ottomans could field. Each carried 50 guns, including heavy siege artillery commonly used on fortress walls. Traditional galley warfare was a collision sport. Galleys rammed, grappled, and boarded. Firepower was secondary to speed and momentum. But galleasses inverted that logic. They were floating gun platforms, too armored to sink easily, too heavily armed to approach without catastrophic casualties. Their crews didn't need to row into melee. They could stand off at range and pound enemy formations into splinters. Don John placed the 6 galleasses 50 yards ahead of his main line, spread evenly across the 4-mile front. As the Ottoman fleet advanced in its crescent formation, designed to envelop the Christian flanks, they had to pass through a killing zone. The galleasses opened fire at a range of 300 yards. The sound was unprecedented. Witnesses on both sides described the noise as continuous thunder, a roar that drowned out commands and disoriented crews. The effect was catastrophic. Ottoman galleys, built for speed and close combat, had thin hulls designed to minimize weight. Galleass cannon punched through them like parchment. Ships took multiple hits before they could close the distance. Oars shattered, sending splinters through the rowers below deck. Cannonballs designed for demolishing fortress walls carved entire sections out of Ottoman hulls. Galleys that had taken minutes to row into position sank in seconds. The psychological impact matched the physical destruction. The Ottoman plan relied on overwhelming the Christian center through sheer numbers. However, as their forward galleys disintegrated under fire, they were unable to return effectively, and panic spread through the trailing formations. Captains hesitated. The tight crescent formation, essential for envelopment, fractured as ships tried to avoid the galleass guns. By the time the Ottoman line reached the Christian galleys for hand-to-hand fighting, their cohesion was already breaking. The fleets collided just after noon. 500 ships, 180,000 men, compressed into a space 4 miles wide and less than a mile deep. The fighting was immediate, total, and obscenely violent. Galleys rammed prow to prow, soldiers pouring across boarding planks before the ships even stopped moving. Arquebuses fired point-blank into packed ranks. Pikes thrust through gaps in armor. Men fell into the water wearing 40 pounds of steel and drowned before they could surface. The Christian center, Don John's squadron, smashed directly into Ali Pasha's flagship, Sultana. The Real and Sultana locked together, and for 2 hours, The battle for the Ottoman flagship became the hinge on which the entire engagement turned. Spanish soldiers poured onto the deck of the Sultana. Ottoman janissaries, the empire's elite infantry, met them with musket volleys that cut down the first wave before they reached the mainmast. The second wave made it halfway across the deck. The third pushed the janissaries back to the stern. Ali Pasha fought personally, rallying his men as Spanish soldiers closed around him. Accounts differ on the exact moment of his death. Some say he fell to a musket ball, others that he was cut down by Spanish swordsmen. What is certain is that when he died, his head was severed and mounted on a pike. A Spanish soldier raised it above the Sultana's deck, visible to both fleets. The effect was immediate. Ottoman morale, already strained by the galleous bombardment and the ferocity of the Christian assault, collapsed. The center, which had been holding against overwhelming pressure, broke. Galleys that had been locked in melee disengaged, oarsmen rowing frantically to escape. The Ottoman formation, which had maintained coherence for nearly 2 hours, disintegrated into a rout. But the collapse in the center triggered the moment Don John had gambled on: the slave revolt. Christian oarsmen chained below deck on Ottoman galleys saw their captors retreating, saw Ottoman officers distracted by the chaos above. They broke their chains. Some accounts claim they were freed by sympathetic overseers, while others report that they simply tore the oarlocks from the benches. Either way, they turned on the Turkish crews. Ottoman galleys became internal battlefields. Turkish soldiers fighting not just the Christians boarding from outside, but the slaves revolting from within. The mutiny spread faster than any message system could coordinate. One galley after another descended into chaos as Christian slaves overwhelmed their guards. Ottoman captains couldn't retreat effectively with their own crews in revolt. They couldn't reorganize a defense when half their men were fighting the other half. The internal collapse multiplied the Christian advantage, transforming a hard-fought tactical victory into a strategic annihilation. Miguel de Cervantes, 24 years old, fought aboard the galley Marquesa in the center of the Christian line. He had been suffering from fever for days, vomiting throughout the night before the battle. His captain offered him the option to stay below deck during the fighting. It was an honorable choice. No one would have questioned it. Cervantes refused. He demanded assignment to the most exposed position on the galley, a skiff towed behind the main ship, used for boarding actions. The skiff was a death sentence in galley warfare. It carried 12 soldiers who would row alongside enemy ships, tie on, and attempt to board while under fire from above. Survival rates were catastrophic. Cervantes knew this. He went anyway, driven by the same quixotic vision of knightly glory that would later define his most famous character. He took 2 arquebus balls to the chest and a third through his left hand, shattering the bones. The hand never recovered function. For the rest of his life, Cervantes carried the nickname El Manco de Lepanto, the one-armed man of Lepanto. He considered it his proudest title, writing decades later that he would rather have been present at that battle than whole in body but absent from it. The irony is precise. The man who would spend his literary career deconstructing romantic notions of chivalry earned his defining trauma by embodying those notions completely. Lepanto gave Cervantes his wound, his pride, and the raw material for Don Quixote. The battle became a permanent reference point in his work, not because it was glorious, but because he lived through the gap between the ideal and the reality. Knights didn't charge into battle for abstract virtue. They bled, screamed, drowned, and died, often for causes they barely understood. Cervantes survived by accident. Thousands of others did not. Spanish soldiers, Venetian sailors, Ottoman janissaries, Christian slaves. The water in the Gulf of Patras turned red. Contemporary accounts describe it simply. The sea was dyed with blood, ships burned, Men in armor drowned. The fighting lasted 4 hours. By the time it stopped, somewhere between 30,000 and 40,000 men were dead. The Holy League lost 7,500 men. The Ottomans lost between 30,000 and 40,000. 200 Ottoman galleys were captured, destroyed, or sunk. 13 Christian ships were lost. The disparity was absolute. As a tactical engagement, Lepanto was one of the most decisive naval battles in history. The liberation of Christian slaves gave the victory immediate moral weight. Between 12,000 and 15,000 men were freed from Ottoman galleys, most of them chained for years. The sight of thousands of freed captives rowing Christian galleys back to Italy provided the propaganda the Holy League needed. Pope Pius V declared it a miracle, attributing the victory to the intercession of the Virgin Mary. He instituted a new feast day, Our Lady of Victory, to commemorate the battle. Philip II of Spain ordered a Te Deum sung in every church in his empire. The news reached Constantinople 3 weeks later. Sultan Selim II ordered the immediate execution of every Spanish and Venetian captive in Ottoman territory. Hundreds of men were killed in retaliation. His Grand Vizier, Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, provided the empire's official response. In seizing Cyprus, we cut off your arm. In destroying our fleet, you merely shaved our beard. Your arm will never grow back. Our beard will grow in stronger than before. The analogy was accurate. The Ottoman Empire began rebuilding its fleet immediately. Within 6 months, they had replaced the lost galleys. Within 2 years, they had retaken Tunis from the Spanish. The strategic impact of Lepanto was negligible. The Ottomans kept Cyprus. The Holy League failed to follow up the naval victory with any coordinated land campaign. The alliance, declared perpetual, began fracturing within months. Venice, prioritizing trade over crusade, negotiated a separate peace with the Ottomans in 1573. The terms were humiliating. Venice abandoned claims to Cyprus, paid a massive indemnity, and agreed to increase tribute for continued trading rights. Spain, frustrated by Venetian betrayal, redirected its resources toward fighting Protestant England and suppressing rebellion in the Netherlands. The Pope, having achieved his symbolic victory, couldn't force secular powers to maintain a war that no longer served their interests. Don John of Austria, the hero of Lepanto, spent the rest of his short life trying to recapture the glory of that single afternoon. He died at 31, commanding Spanish forces in the Netherlands, never again achieving the recognition that briefly made him the most celebrated commander in Europe. Lepanto secured nothing permanent. The Ottoman Empire remained dominant in the eastern Mediterranean for another century. The Holy League dissolved into mutual recrimination. The strategic balance of power didn't shift, but the psychological impact was real and lasting. For the first time in a generation, Christian Europe believed it could defeat the Ottomans in open battle. The myth of Ottoman invincibility died in the Gulf of Patras, even if the empire itself did not. The battle's enduring significance lies not in what it achieved strategically, but in what it revealed about early modern warfare. The reliance on enslaved human beings as the engine of naval power created a tactical vulnerability neither side could solve. The introduction of galleasses demonstrated that firepower was beginning to supersede the importance of ramming and boarding. The fragility of the Holy League exposed the limits of religious ideology in holding together alliances driven by competing national interests. Lepanto was the last great galley battle, a final expression of an ancient form of warfare already being rendered obsolete by cannon and sail. It was also a preview of the world to come. Wars fought by nation-states pursuing secular interests under the banner of religious ideology, sustained by industrial-scale violence, and justified by propaganda that obscured the human cost. The men chained to oars, Christian and Muslim alike, paid the price for empires that claimed divine favor while depending on human misery for propulsion. Their liberation was celebrated, their suffering exploited, their names forgotten. Lepanto freed 12,000 slaves and created a myth of Christian triumph. The Ottoman beard grew back, the Venetian arm did not, and the Mediterranean remained contested, as it had been for centuries, as it would be for centuries more.